Okay, my name's Jonathan Mark. I'm glad everyone came tonight. And we're going to show first A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon by Bart Sibrel. He's an imaginative, wonderful filmmaker that was challenged because he grew up loving the astronauts, and he had pictures of them on his walls. And then when he started looking into the photography issues, he saw a lot of gaps in reality as a filmmaker, which we'll see here. And then Fox News asked him to make a movie, and he got so into it that he spent thousands of hours producing what any filmmaker would say a good movie. He does a very excellent job. And it's 47 minutes, it has a lot of philosophy, it has a lot of background about the times of when Apollo reached the moon, with the 1960s revolution and Bangladesh and Vietnam. And so he showed the time and place. Now here we are at 2015, and it's like people not questioning why we haven't gone there before. I don't want to say there's proof that we faked going to the moon. That kind of puts you in a bind, because how can you prove something that didn't happen? And a lot of people say, well, we have proof that happened because they said so. And then I say, well, they lie quite a good bit. And after 9/11, we should not take them at their word, for sure. And then you look back at John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, and they used him as a martyr. And they didn't go along with any of his proposals for world peace and healing. He didn't want to give Israel nuclear weapons. He didn't want a false flag operation to attack Cuba. And so he was taken away, and he was really planning on destroying the whole military-industrial complex and just make it for what it should be, for defense uses, and combining with the world and going to the moon with Russia, because he and Khrushchev was making a lot of movement in that direction for cooperation rather than competition. But Russia, even up to this point, has never gone through the Van Allen belt. They never claimed to have gone through there. And then you wonder why, because they were so far ahead of us. And then people claim it's the rockets, the rocket ship Werner von Braun, another Nazi that the U.S. recruited into our system. So there's good reasons to be skeptical, and it's hard for people to imagine the consequences of such lies and in our face, and how people go along with it. So I'm planting seeds. We're not really trying to get the whole job done at once. It took me 5 years of looking at this movie particularly before I could start really questioning it. And I had to recheck to see if it was accurate. And it has stand up, and it has a lot of accuracy in it. And the time when they tried to go through the Van Allen belt in 1998, they reported, and CNN reported, that the belts were so intense that they only got to 350 miles from the Earth, and the astronauts with the suits on and deflector gear could actually see radiation entering their skulls and going through their heads, and with their eyes closed, because the radiation was crossing their cornea, they could see big flashes of radiation. And CNN called it killer electrons. They were totally shocked that there was so much action out there. At only 350 miles, the belts get thickest around 1,000 miles and goes for at least 25,000 miles. And yet you hear people giving excuses, oh, we could go through by the poles and get through, you go through quick enough. But again, it hasn't happened in all this time. It's like 45 years later. And in 2004, when they decided they wanted to go back to the moon, to get there in 2020, which is suspicious because something they did 6 times in 3 years with 60s technologies. In 2004, they were planning on taking them 14 years to do what they did already. And then in 2010, Obama canceled the mission because they really weren't getting that far, and the expense was much greater than they expected. So they just shoved the whole mission, and still we're waiting for another country or honest people to really declare that we can't live with this type of fraud. It's not so bad. Yeah, Beth.
I don't know if this movie covers it, but what are the thoughts on actually going and landing on the moon? I mean, on the Mars?
Robotically?
Yeah.
Robotically, that's been proven, and they have vehicles on Mars. And that's, it's just a difference when you send a biological being through this radiation. They could survive the electronics. but they really can't survive.
So you think the Mars landings have happened?
Yes, and my friend Bart Jordan, who I interviewed, was actually involved with the Mariner 9 mission, which is the first planet that was orbited besides the Earth. And he was also involved with the Viking mission that took those incredible pictures of the Cydonia region and the face on Mars, which Bart Jordan claims that he received that information from these ancient Greek language that he was able to decipher, and saying that over hundreds of thousands of years ago they had this experience and they actually placed the two moons in orbit. Phobos and Deimos are not actually moons, they're really asteroids, and one's going around one direction, the other one's going the opposite direction, the same plane. And then he has, from this, it connects with the cesium number, and he's working on something to prove this. So if you go to my website and look up evidence of ancient advanced civilizations, at flybynews.com, you'll get to learn about that and about his Mars and the stuff he's working on now to prove that he gave the Mariner 9 mission the numbers and stuff.
What was the time frame between Kennedy's assassination and the moon?
6 years. 6 years, and he wanted to go there before the end of the decade. It was very unlikely. Gus Grissom was one of the astronauts that said, "You'll never get there," and he died in an accident. And his son thinks that he was murdered because he wasn't going to go along with the charade of that.
Yeah.
So
does it mean that all the other people have gone along with the charade? I mean, all
Yes.
the people in politics, all their families.
well, you ever
friends.
see Neil Armstrong? He was like a broken person, and it mentions this in him too, in this movie too, about his feelings, and you could actually see that he was a broken man. He really didn't want to give interviews. When you're in bed with the devil in a way, if you don't do what they want, there's consequences when they really do cover-ups. And so I don't blame them or the other astronauts for going along with it.
But it mustn't be much fun
Oh.
choosing to live like that.
It was painful. That's why you're so
Yeah,
broken.
I know.
So I think I'm going to start the film now, so
Okay.
we're almost on schedule.
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large. Yet perhaps the starting ground for all these conflicts lays somewhere deeper, within the very character of the human condition, in the dark, untouchable crevices of the human heart. It is said that the first iniquity of free will began even before the maiden pilgrimage from the embryo, preceding the very creation of the earth itself, in the forelife of souls in the heavenly realms. The dawn of warfare, some believe, was initiated by a fallen angel whose trespass against God was pride. In ancient Babylonia, in an age so long ago that the exact millennium remains in question, the Tower of Babel began construction. It was to be the single greatest achievement of the human race. A tower so tall that its summit would reach the heavens, and by it prove to the world that their race was superior. It would be God's irony that it would never be finished. Time passed, nations fell, a machine age emerged, and once again the ingenuity of the species which held dominion over all others unveiled what was at the time the most monumental accomplishment ever imagined, the largest machine yet constructed. An automation so mammoth and so revered, even before its first demonstration, that its only befitting name was Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it set sail. It was boasted to be the ship that God himself could not sink. It would be God's irony that the very element that was meant to keep it afloat would cause it to sink. Water, frozen water, in the form of an iceberg. Not even one voyage did it complete. And then the next age embarked into the annals of human history. Perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting satellite, the first animal, the first man. They had logged 500% more hours in space than the United States. And in June of 1969, they launched an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve the first soil sample from another world, just 1 month before Apollo 11. That's how close the race was. Had their unmanned probe not crash-landed into the lunar surface, the first moon rock brought back to Earth would have been by the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon, president at the time, had this to say about the latest work of the human hand. It is the greatest week since creation, the greatest event since the laying of the foundation of the seas, since the origin of the universe itself, since the design and formation of the delicate human eye through which all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
Come and take a trip in my rocket ship. We'll have a lovely afternoon. Kiss the world goodbye, and away we'll fly. Destination moon. We'll travel fast as a light till we're out of sight. The earth will be like a toy balloon. Oh, what a thrill you'll get riding on my jet. A destination moon. Oh, we'll go up, 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 up. Straight to the moon we two. High in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my space mobile, a supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull the switch, let's go. A destination moon. moon, we two. We'll be high in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my jetmobile, a supersonic honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull that switch, let's go. Destination, we're flying high up in the sky. Destination, destination moon.
Dr. von Braun, how would you say we stand in relation to the Russians, and do you think we can ever catch up?
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability, and that at the moment, the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We've got to have no finite end to our objectives. The end of our objectives should be as far as we can see at any given time. But right now, we need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr, not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. $135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives. It could also buy 2 million two-bedroom houses. Yet how could such an undertaking be kept secret, and for such a long time? To the latter, one needs only to remember that an unsolved riddle 6 years older, the assassination of President Kennedy, still daunts the minds of the vast majority of Americans. As a parent of a conspiracy, as his assassin being assassinated himself, the truth of the matter has still escaped history. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out. A quarter century later, the art and technology of espionage inevitably improved, narrowing dramatically the number of players in the know of a large clandestine operation. Just 1 year before the first mission to the moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude, and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it were descending to the moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the Moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the Moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. The greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment, there is only one full-body picture of him on the Moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the Moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom-seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the Moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here, a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of 2 pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a Norman Rockwell depiction drawn just 2 years earlier based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there. Not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the Moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr., and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're mapping in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue gas, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy. Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history. NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All 3 Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return. On the 25th anniversary of the event, in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you, we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise up or come forward and free the citizens and themselves from the sin that so easily entangles and from a federal government that needs to have the gangrene cut off. Even if the government's destruction would come from the truth, then it is not worthy to stand, and its betterment would inevitably follow. All of us are mortal. All of us will die. Perhaps the seeking of a clear conscience before that hour will motivate the truth into the light. Perhaps as citizens we should offer amnesty for this and other crimes of history, for facts from those involved, before the truth perishes with them. Why must we wait until the year 2017 to open the Kennedy assassination files? Perhaps they will not even be opened then, for the law that reluctantly stipulates their release says so with this clause, quote, with the exception of documents certified for continued postponement by the President. Whoever believes the citizens to be too immature for the truth are too immature for power. The truth will always set us free.
Okay, well, the Orwell quote is pretty amazing. Those who control the past control our future. He also added in the Orwell book, those who control the present control the past. And so the ones controlling our present is, creating a false history. And because of that history, we're going in a future based on untruth and lies, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and we end up with chemtrails and all the other issues. Anybody that wants to give their comments on this film that wants to come up here, I'll move away. You just put your toes on the thing, and we'll get your comments. Did you want to mention that?
Sure.
That would be awesome.
I'm Jim. I was thinking, so I was thinking about this production. I've seen this movie before, and I was thinking about, we talked before watching it about truth and lies and propaganda and all that. And I not only believe, but I know that we went to the moon. And so I'm a skeptic of this. And all I can say is that this is the silliest movie I've ever seen in my life. And I'll give you several reasons. I mean, I don't want to go point by point, but for example, Mr. Sobrell talks about how we were behind the Russians at a certain point in the 60s, which is completely untrue. The Russians had the first astronaut. They did have the first 2-man and 3-person spacecraft in the early to mid-60s. But by the mid-60s, the Americans had the Gemini program going, where they were flying 2-person craft at the same time. They had 10 Gemini flights between 1963 and 1966. All 2-man crews. The Russians, Soviets back then, only had, I think, about 5 2-man crews. They actually, he mislabeled one of the photographs. He talked about how the Russians had docked in space. They never did that. They might have done it once with the 2 Soyuz spacecraft, but the picture he showed was a picture of a Gemini spacecraft coming up to an Agena spacecraft, which was how the Americans practiced the docking rendezvous. And they did that, I think, 3 times in the Gemini spacecraft program. And it's completely untrue that that the Russians knew about the Van Allen belts, and that's why they didn't go. The Russians had built a moon rocket. It was called the Proton rocket, and the reason they didn't go to the moon is because it exploded on the pad. And actually, we learned just relatively short time ago, because the Russians had been so secretive with their space program. We learned just a few years ago that it exploded on the pad and killed a lot of the pad workers. There weren't no astronauts or cosmonauts on the craft at the same time. So the Russians were totally on board and going through the Van Allen belts and going to the moon. In terms of the Van Allen belts, they do have thicknesses and thinnesses as they orbit and you know, the NASA scientists knew about the Van Allen belts. They were discovered by James Van Allen. In fact, it was the first U.S. satellite that went up, Explorer 1, right after Sputnik. It was about a month after Sputnik in 1957 that discovered the Van Allen belts. And they were named after James Van Allen, who interpreted the data. He himself said that the astronauts could get through the Van Allen belts with no problem if they went through the thinnest reaches of them. He said that they would experience maybe what you get during a chest X-ray at the dentist's office. So you know, Sobrell makes this big talk about how nobody can get through the Van Allen belts. They did, and they can, and they probably wasn't the healthiest thing to do, but it wasn't lethal, as he claims. Question?
I was wondering, how do you explain that the Russians never done it and that the U.S. hasn't gone through that area in 45 years?
Well, basically, I mean, the space race was a political thing. It was sort of this march of technology. Who could be the best? Who could be the first? And once the Americans got to the moon in 1969, for all intents and purposes, the space race was over. And in fact, I saw a clip of Alexei Leonov, who was you saw them showing the cosmonaut sort of waving at the camera when he took a spacewalk. He was the first spacewalker, and he knew, I mean, the astronauts and cosmonauts, despite the Cold War, were good friends. They did mingle, they did mix. In fact, they mixed in 1975 during the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where they had an Apollo spacecraft and a Soyuz from Russia dock, and they shook hands and everything. It was a start of détente, basically, between the two countries. But back to your question, Alexei Leonov, I saw a clip of him. He was being interviewed. How'd you feel about the Americans beating you to the moon? He said, well, they did a good job, and we clap for them, and then we go home. So that's the reason the Russians didn't go. As I said, their moon rocket blew up on the pad, and they didn't have anything to fall back on at that point, especially because Apollo 11 and then Apollo 12 and all the way through Apollo 17, in the next 3 years, landed on the moon. It was a show. Like, it was a show. It was a space race,
So it's military connected.
Yeah. Well, it was military connected because we already had the missiles in place. For example, we had the Redstone and Atlas boosters that launched the Mercury capsules. We had the Titan missile, which was also a military missile that flew the Gemini. We had to construct the Apollo Saturn V. There were 3 generations of it. There was a Saturn I, Saturn 1B, which launched Apollo 7, the first manned launch, and then Saturn V launched the moon rockets. That was Wernher von Braun's brainchild. And then the second part of your question was, why haven't we gone back? It comes down to money. In fact, there were supposed to be 3 more manned missions to the moon, Apollo 18, 19, and 20. And I forget when it was. I think it was probably around 1970 or so that Congress took away the money for that. And so it all comes down to money. Once we did our exploration, we won the moon race, we got some rocks, came back. Congress said no more, and nobody's wanted to go to the moon since because they didn't want to spend the money.
Jim, that sounds lovely, but they've got $700 billion to get the banks out of. I think they find money when they need money. Why not for the moon mission?
Well, it's basically after the moon missions, we decided we wanted to concentrate on low Earth orbit, so we orbited Skylab. The Russians have had the Mir space station, the Salyut space station, and then we all got together on the International Space Station, which not only the Russians and the Soviets, or the United States, I'm sorry.
Do you really think that they're just going to give it up? Like, we've achieved everything now, we're going to go to the moon.
Well, in 2004, they were planning on getting back to the moon. And in 16 years planning mission.
Right.
And it was 6 years of funding it, like $1 billion was funded in 2004, and I believe every year up to 2010. And they couldn't do it. That's like 2010, 2004, that's 6 years. And yet they did it 6 times in 3 years in the 60s technology. You would think it'd be much easier by then in 2004 to get to the moon way before 2020, but they didn't even accomplish that. And so maybe it's not just the money issue.
Well, first of all, I mean, the point about how we got there in 6 years in 1960s technology, people were working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The engineers, the rocket scientists, the astronauts, they had this goal. That's the main thing. They had a goal in 1970, to get there, and they also had the motivation to beat the Russians. Those 2 things really, lit a fire. And, in terms of, Obama and Nixon, I read about that. I think it was George H.W. Bush who talked about, we're going to go to the moon. I was excited by that. And I don't know the details. I think it comes down to politics. But somebody just said, okay, we're just not going to spend the money. It's already been done. Why do it again?
So I have a question.
Yeah, okay.
Just how when you walked up here, you said, oh, I know that they've been to the moon.
Okay, sure.
What's your expertise?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I would challenge that. I mean, first of all, it's in every single history book around the world.
Oh, that's nothing.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. Let me ask you a question. How do you know that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States?
I don't.
She's asking you for your qualifications. That's the main thing.
Okay.
Why you?
Well, Because I believe what I read. I know that's. I mean.
Well, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, that's my question. Why do you believe anything? You know, I believe. I mean.
But that's a very valid question. Why do you believe anything?
Okay. I can. Well, I'll tell you why I believe. Well, first of all, because it's in every history book in the world. You know, we have photographs. We have moon rocks. We have.
There have been some issues about those moon rocks.
Such as?
That they,
well, one of the astronauts that gave it to a museum, they discovered
in Holland. It was in Holland. Yeah, I mean
that was fossilized wood.
Okay, there are moon rocks in every country, major country around the world that have been given as gifts. The scientists there have studied them. I'm sure the Russians got a ton of them. You know, the Russians knew about this. They wanted to do the same thing. There's never been a single credible scientist who's come forth and said these moon rocks are fake.
That's the reason.
Well, not all of them are. Maybe they could pick them up robotically. So I'm just saying, like, what do you think about? I know a lot of people here are, you know, questioning 9/11. Do you believe the official version of 9/11? Do you think there was a cover-up?
Well, I mean, I haven't. I know space travel is a hobby of mine. It's been ever since I was little. I mean, I had pictures of the astronauts on my wall too, just like him. I really don't have any specific opinion about 9/11.
Yeah.
I mean, I know about the doubters and, you know, saying that there were demolition. Yeah, and that's what it looks like. But I don't know.
I'm so glad you're here because I don't usually find people that disagree.
Yeah.
But were you going to see for the other film? Because I'd like to get your feedback on.
Yeah, I mean, there was one other point I wanted to make because you were asking why do I believe? Well, okay, yeah, and you know, scientists, you know, and you know, he talks about only a few people saw the few picture. Which few people were there? He never identifies that. Then he shows the picture of that guy smoking a cigarette, saying, "This is like the actor telling them what." I mean, he never identifies who that is. You know, how can you just say this person? And the whole thing about the missing footage and the moon or the Earth shot, that the voiceover woman is talking over that same thing. And here's an excellent point. I can probably end on this. Is that, you know, we're talking about the main concern that everybody here has is, are we being lied to? During that whole shot about the moon, or the Earth, and what the Earth appears to be looking like, she's reading a script that he wrote that is telling us what to believe. He's saying the actors are, the astronauts are going through the acting and being told when to talk. Well, how do we know that that's the truth? Well, what the truth is of that thing is they're rehearsing for a TV broadcast. That's what I believe.
Well, there's a lot of manipulation to making a film. I'm not going to disagree with you.
Yeah, and it's just like, but this, and I've read a lot of reviews about this movie, and there are a lot of people say, oh yeah, we didn't go to the movie, it's all lies. But I combat that with saying, how do you know that he's not making all this up too?
Well, why would they want to?
But that's a very good point.
Like, why would anyone want to go through all that to make it up?
Because he has a point of view that he thinks is correct. And most of this is speculation. I mean, if you go through this, it's like, how could they do this? Well, maybe they did this, maybe they did this. There are no facts here,
All right, can I
and there's
ask you
no
something,
evidence.
please, that this will be a fact?
Sure.
How can you get...
Sure. You want to have like a round table?
I'm just going to go around.
Do you want me to go over there?
That'd be good. And if anybody doesn't want to be photographed, let me know. I know Michael.
They talked about the Van Allen belt, and how you could go through thinnesses of it, certain thinnesses, and you can get through them.
Yeah.
What technology will enable you to know where to go to get to those thin parts?
I mean, I don't know for sure. I'm not a space scientist. I would imagine that the satellites at the time they had up there could detect where the belts were thin.
It looks
but
like
do
a
you know
picture,
this? I mean, or is that, have they got the technology? Because they do have satellites, but can the satellites detect that? Can the satellites detect cell phone
It was the satellite that detected them in the first place. That's how they know they're there.
Yeah, right. But so then you've got to know by the time you've got to preempt where these things, I guess they're not always thin in the same spot. It might be like chemtrails. You know, they kind of like thin out in parts and all that.
And actually, they did, the NASA scientists calculated where they needed to fly through once they leave the Earth's orbit, and knew where the capsule had to be, so they go through the thin part.
Now, does that thin part change?
You know, I don't know if they revolve or if they stay stationary. I don't know that.
Because, you know, you could prove this just by the subsequent flights that happened, and what their trajectory and what their path was, and what's their, what that
You want to
was.
do all that research?
That's what I'm just saying.
No, but another thing too, why didn't they mention the Van Allen?
The Van Allen belt.
Why didn't they say, oh, we've got through the thick part. We've had the satellite is telling us how to get to the thick, the reports of the journey. Why didn't they say even mention the Van Allen belts? Wasn't even mentioned.
I would say that probably the public wasn't interested.
Oh,
are you kidding me?
They were fascinated.
Oh, so they said, we don't mention the Van Allen belts because the public won't be interested.
No,
This is a major thing to get through. This is something why we can't get through it today. Even today we can't get through it.
I would say they didn't think it was part of it. I didn't think it was part of the story. I mean, you know, I remember watching the moon missions on TV. They would show the things they would show. They'd show the liftoff, then they'd show the docking of the command module.
They can do all that. They can do all that. Stanley Kubrick did that.
If I may address, what's your name?
Jim.
Jim's point, you know, how do we know to believe this?
Yeah.
How do we know? And that's what my point has been with 9/11, with geoengineering, with anything, is that we need to get to the point where we trust the source of the information, that we see it as a credible source. Is it going to be some, you know, architects and engineers for 9/11 truth? Is it going to be a scientist? Is it going to be someone from the military? Who are the experts with regards to the moon landing? Is Neil Armstrong going to come forth before?
He's dead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He's dead now.
Okay.
But this other film has a lot of scientists that do give a lot of credibility in their
Don't put that
questioning.
part in, I didn't know.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I know one of the moonwalkers personally.
You do?
He walked on the moon on Apollo 14.
How come he resigned so quick?
So who is that?
His name is Edgar Mitchell. He was on Apollo 14.
Okay.
So he's a different.
And
So you know him personally?
yeah, I've met him a couple
Okay.
times. I've visited him.
Okay.
And, you know, I, like I said, I'm fascinated by this whole thing, and space and astronauts. And
Now, where does he live?
he lives in Florida.
Okay. Can he come up and visit us?
Probably not, because he's pretty old by now.
Okay.
You don't want to push those guys either because they're under a lot of pressure to go along, according to me. But do you know much about the Orion mission that was done like a year ago?
Well, that was a test flight, I think.
A test flight to test the Van Allen belts. It went to 2,000 miles out, but we don't know because again it's classified. So whatever happens in space, the military seems to have taken over. You know, what we know and what we don't know. I would wish we could know what they really discovered because then we'd know a lot about the Van Allen belts. But it's not just the belts that the astronauts would have to be afraid of without the protection in outer space, but it's a solar flare, which there was reports of solar flare at the time of the Apollo lunar missions.
Yeah, they're not to be taken lightly, but
no,
they didn't have any major flares.
Well, let's just say, how long will it be, like, this is the question I always ask, how long will it be before you start getting skeptical by them not going out beyond low orbit? I mean, how long, will it be another 20 years if they don't go beyond low orbit? Will you be skeptical then of their claims in 1960s?
The priorities have changed. I mean, there's a...
Science doesn't go...
Actually, I think, given the state of the environment right now, the priority of this country should be making sure that people can get to outer space, because we may all have to get there. And I'm not joking.
Well, you know what worries me? And technology will come out, and these people that you're trusting, these wonderful people that you're trusting, they are going to go and they're going to demolish this planet.
No, they're not going to go anywhere. They're not going anywhere. Space.
No, I'm saying when they get the technology.
They won't get the technology. We're going to be destroying our world before we're able to do that.
I know that the big question comes up, why haven't we gone back? And it's because Congress doesn't want to spend the money, and it's not a priority.
But they can find $700 billion to pay the banks off, just to make sure that they don't get
That's a different issue.
No, but it doesn't matter, it's a
Money.
different issue. It's, it's money. That's
Are
the
you aware
different
that
issue.
they exploded a hydrogen bomb and nuclear bombs up near the Van Allen belt, about 400 miles from the Earth? This is the mentality of these generals. 1964, 2.5 times the Nagasaki.
In space?
Yeah,
They exploded
400 miles from the Earth.
hydrogen bombs?
A hydrogen bomb in the 50s and test blast, and
I
then
thought
in the
they were
60s.
just doing it on the Earth.
For what purpose, Jonathan?
I think, well, some people say they were trying to punch a hole through the belts, but they actually created a third belt that with this radioactive bombs, and they thought it was going to.
I know why.
And they claimed.
I think I know why.
They claimed they were wanted to get to mess up with the Russian satellites, but they didn't. They expected to go away real quick. Why they thought that, who knows? But it actually formed another layer of radiation around us.
Did it?
And so, there's a lot of, with that type of mentality of that type of hubris.
It's funny.
Well, I would say, if getting back to the original question, that has nothing to do with whether we land on the moon or not. I mean, and he shows us this close-up image of JFK getting his brains blown up. What does that have to do with the moon?
Well, if they could do that, they could take over the media.
It's the argument ad hominem where you get people, where you're showing the starting
Because
kids.
people really
It's getting
are
people
like that.
emotional about it,
Well, we do
and they
it
want to
very
believe
much.
what he's
But
saying.
shouldn't you be emotional about being lied to from why didn't they teach people about Tesla? They only taught people about Edison. All of the books taught only about Edison. They didn't teach about Tesla.
Good
I even asked somebody from Harvard. They didn't even know who Tesla was. They thought I was referring to a car. I said Nikola Tesla. He was a physics student at Harvard, MIT. And, why don't they leave information out just like they let the stars out?
Well, that's another question I want to address about the stars. And he says, well, why didn't they bring a telescope? That wasn't the point of this mission. The point of the mission was to land on the moon.
We've never been to the moon
Wait a minute,
before.
Let me finish.
All those Apollo
Let me finish. I'm answering your question.
Okay,
Don't
but
interrupt
why do
me.
you keep on doing
Don't
what
interrupt
we
me.
know?
Don't interrupt me.
Just relax, will you?
Don't interrupt me.
Well, it's a very emotional topic, but go ahead.
I'm trying to explain the reason why they didn't bring a telescope. First of all, it would be too much weight. Second of all, the reason is because this is a moon landing mission. It wasn't a stargazing mission. They wanted to land on the moon. They wanted to,
So they need a dune buggy, which is much heavier than
they
a
had the lunar
telescope.
rover so they could travel farther, so they could go farther and explore better, more terrain.
Couldn't they have, couldn't you take a picture if you're not in direct sunlight and see the stars from another part of the moon? Like not even a telescope?
No, because they landed on the moon in sunlight, so they could see what they're doing. You can't take a picture in direct sunlight.
No, but couldn't they have used the rovers to go to a different part of the moon?
They'd have to go to the dark side of the moon.
How long would that take?
That would have taken several days.
But I agree with that one point, that, who says that one of their goals was to see the stars?
It
It's a
wasn't.
very good
That's
point.
the whole point.
So when we
They
get
weren't
into
landing
these
on the moon.
discussions, we've had these kinds of discussions at the 9/11 meetings where when we have different viewpoints all in the same room, I think it's interesting to look at that.
Yeah.
Why do we believe what we believe? Why are we willing to believe one version versus another? That's what
the key
fascinates
word.
me.
The key word is belief.
Yeah.
And
Right.
what set of facts do you base your beliefs
Yeah,
on?
because honestly,
when do
I
opinions
find
become beliefs and why are they formed?
and I
And
find
that's-
this format kind of frustrating,
So,
honestly, because I would like to have a
Like
facilitated
this.
discussion about,
Like
okay,
a
let's
debate?
listen to
A debate.
discussion
That's good.
based on
Nobody kills
facts,
anybody.
and because there's facts and there's opinion, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, and I'm curious, okay, your friend, is it a friend that the man who?
He's an acquaintance.
Okay, so then in what environment were you learning that he was the moonwalker? How did you meet?
Because
What kind of
I
environment
watched
was
his,
he
I
in?
actually, when I was little, I watched his flight on TV.
Okay.
And read about it in the papers, read about it in the World Book Encyclopedia. And then later on, like maybe about 5-10 years ago, he had a website where he invited a forum, like people could ask him questions about space
So
and
he
science.
actually wanted to do that.
And so I was asking all these different questions, and so we sort of got to know each other that way. And then I asked him to sign a book for me, and he sent me a book. And then I just, so we sort of got to know each other informally that way. And then a few years ago, I sent him an email. I just said, I'd really like to meet you. Can I do that? He said, sure. So.
But my question, and again, I'm not meaning to argue. It's
No,
more
go
like,
ahead.
why do you believe what he's saying? Why is he more believable than
Why not?
the?
Well, that's always what
But
it
hold
is.
on,
Why
hold
not?
on.
Go ahead.
Let me finish my sentence now.
Sure.
that just like these astronauts in this film, they're part of a government program. They're told what to do. They're going to go ahead and do it. They're getting paid a certain amount. They're brainwashed, perhaps, whatever. Why would we then, how can we prove that is what they did? And that they're not just part of a whole big story. You see, the difference between perhaps yourself, sir, and some of us in the room is, Jim, my memory's not so good, is that some of us have been part of the 9/11 Truth Movement and have pretty direct knowledge, and we were in this very room meeting Richard Gage, who was the architect who started Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We watched a film filled with fact about the buildings and why it was demolished. What do you call it? Controlled demolition. Why the official story just cannot be true. So we're kind of, I won't speak for you, I don't know you, but us four in Ajax too, you know, we've got that very recent experience, what, a few weeks ago. So knowing that and knowing that the government has lied to us about that, then I say, oh, go backwards.
Well,
of course they could be lying about
I would
this.
say about one thing I don't know about 9/11. I saw a Nova special about 9/11, and they had architects and engineers, building engineers, watching the buildings come down, and they said this is how it happened. So again, it's like, who do you choose to believe? Because they're saying
they said
those are
what
their
about
facts. They were saying why the buildings.
They had models of showing why the building collapsed.
Yeah, and they said it had nothing to do with.
But it never happened before in all of history, so through office fires, so there's a lot of people that doubt it.
That's what it was. So
You
anyway.
said, why do you believe them and not the others and all this? This is why I don't believe them. Jim.
When you say them, what do you mean?
I mean the government, other corporations, or anybody who gets paid for anything. I don't believe anybody who gets paid for anything because they've got a different version of everything. But the reason I don't believe the government is because
You're talking about in general or just all this?
Yeah, no, just all governments in general, and 100%. This is why I don't believe it. Is because, but especially I'm talking now in reference to the American government. Is that we went to Iraq. They made a mistake in their, predictions about the weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
I'm still waiting for this.
Yeah.
That's why I don't believe it.
That's a heck of a lie right there.
Yeah.
I want sorry for those lies. And if they're not going to say sorry, then that I would not trust them. As far as I can throw,
Also with Kennedy, why did they haven't released the investigations? Like the U.S. Senate committee actually investigated the Kennedy assassination 10 years after the Warren Commission came out with their report and said that they were more than 95% sure that there was a conspiracy. And after they said that, and they did a lot of research and they had acoustic tests, all those files are being withheld from the public, so we can't even see the details of that. We only heard the summary of it. So when that happened in 1963, and then you had the whole foreign policy engaged after Kennedy was killed with Vietnam and ongoing wars ever since. You wonder did the U.S. government get taken over by a shadow type of intelligence CIA group who now controls a lot of presidents ever since Kennedy. And so with that issue, it makes me question everything. It took me a long time because I was only 12 when that happened with Kennedy. And then researching it, it's almost like undeniable to me, like 9/11 is undeniable that there was complicity and a cover-up. And if you can cover it up and have the mainstream media, you get brainwashed. You get, you want to believe it, and you're told it so often. So those are hard things to buck. That's why I'm lucky you're coming here, because not too many people could push against that. And even the people that question it, it's very hard for us.
What I see when people say, "Oh, we didn't land on the moon," and they give these reasons, they're all speculation. There's no evidence and there's no proof. It's all and what it is like, okay, if we had faked it, maybe this is the way they did it. But there's no proof that we.
I agree with you on that.
And
what's your name?
Denise.
Denise, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I drive people to distraction. I don't blame you. Okay. Chomsky and people like this, they don't want to talk about 9/11, and it's always, you can always tell when people don't want to talk about something, because like you've done a really great thing that you've come out in a group of people who are against what your position is, and I really applaud you for that.
Yeah, and we're not trying to prove. I'm not saying we do have proof that the moon landing was fake. All I'm saying is that we're skeptical of it because they haven't repeated it in all these other issues. And I rebuttal, I say, how long will it be before you start questioning that while they're not proving it again? Because I know how science and space and exploration works. It gets easier and easier, you get further and further, and you keep going. It's like the moon would be a great military base if we could set it up, or mining and other things, if we could have done that with the 60s technologies. There's a lot of benefits to exploring our whole universe and our closest place. But that's why I'm skeptical, and I'm very willing, once it's done again, and I could see how it's been done and how they could have done it back in the 60s, then I'm willing to admit that, well, maybe I'm wrong, but until then, I'm saying we should be very skeptical.
People say, well, why don't we go back? That proves we didn't, or that maybe we should be skeptical that we didn't do it in the first place at all.
That we should question it.
Or we should question it. And then my point is, well, Congress doesn't want to spend the money. It's not a priority. Why can't those be two perfectly valid reasons?
Because they spent the money for 6 years in a row. Because in 2004 to 2010, they were spending the money, they were trying to get there, and they couldn't do it. And
well, why didn't they just fake it again?
Well, why didn't they just...
We have too much technology to snag it.
We can see it now. Ever since 1972, the Russians could follow us to the moon and watch it. That's one of the reasons why we stopped going.
But that's my question.
Oh,
haven't there been quite a few trips to the moon? What is the film technology? Where is the... Since Apollo 11, what's happened? And
what do you mean?
Why isn't there filming?
Why don't we even see pictures of
Why isn't there compelling evidence to the contrary from all the subsequent missions?
If you go on YouTube, you'll find hours of film from the 6 moon landings. They're right there.
So it's all there.
Oh yeah, go to YouTube. Apollo 12. There's the TV camera.
So all the things that were depicted in this film are kind of done away with by other films that are out there from subsequent missions, in your mind? I don't know, I'm just asking.
I mean, he's using just a few clips to try and prove his point. But, I mean, if, we landed on the moon in Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 13 didn't make it, 14 through 17 made it. That's 6 missions where there's, like I said, there's hours of footage.
And anybody can get it?
Go on YouTube.
It wouldn't cost much for someone to go 1,000, 2,000 miles out and turn around and come back. It really wouldn't cost that much. And they did it with the Orion mission, which was robotic, and they probably had some life forms in there with lead shielding it, and the testing. And it was a test program to see if we can send an astronaut through that radiation belt.
Well,
and that was the purpose of Orion.
Issue as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Because we did it, and it's safe. Even James Van Allen, if you look up James Van Allen.
That's not true. At the very first, he said you couldn't do it, and then later on, when he was coerced, like the astronauts, I believe, were coerced, then he went along with it.
Where's the proof that he was coerced?
Well, that he changed his mind. And let's say, science is something that gets reproduced. You don't do it once and say, trust me, I've done it. You prove it. And there's a lot of doubt. But, do you want to go to the other movie? It has a little bit more scientific.
How long is the other movie?
It's much long. I'm only going to show maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes of it. But it's just the beginning of it. It's about the radiation part.
The point is that, yes, the media is a powerful element here, that even if the information has been proven, how is it getting disseminated? Or is it only known to a very small number of people?
The media is the most culpable, actually, the media.
Well, Will Rogers once said, when I asked him his opinion about a certain thing, Will Rogers, American essayist, he said, how am I supposed to know? All I know is what I read in the papers. And that's all anybody knows is what we are told.
Well, now it's different though. They didn't anticipate the internet, that we could talk to each other. This is something that I don't know how it got out, but they're going to stop it. Believe me, they are going. No, they don't want to stop it completely because they want to make money off of us still, because that's what they do. They suck our blood. What they're doing is they're spraying us like bugs, and they're dropping. I don't know. They don't advertise. You can do the bankers. The bankers are definitely in. The Rothschilds. The Rothschilds.
I did a movie about 2010, 2008, and I spent 2 years putting it together called Perception. Something about 50,000 What's it called? Deception.
Deceptions.
And in the process of doing that, it became really apparent to me that everybody's faced with this dilemma. What do you believe? What do you believe? Everybody lines up what are facts, and if you just look at them, they're facts. But it's how you arrange those facts that you form an opinion, and then a belief comes. Once it hits a belief level, it's incredibly hard, regardless of the facts, because then it kind of reshapes who the person is, what their belief systems have been for 10 or 20 years. And then they say, geez, my life's been kind of a lie. I don't want to. So it really, I'm not talking, I'm just saying some of the people that I've talked about where they've seen, I've actually had clips where you see the person lying and it's on video and they don't believe they're lying.
Yeah.
You know, it's right in front of them and it's happened repeatedly. So they're...
Politicians do that.
Yes, very good.
And you know, so it's, when you see something like this, there are other things, I don't know about maybe the landing of the moon, but there are things with 9/11 and the buildings collapse and Building 7 that there's compelling facts.
May I mention one other thing that's related here, as far as the media? And Jonathan, you know this fact, that, well, I'll put it this way as a question. In which country has there been more death in one concentrated conflict, 10 million deaths, since World War II?
10 million?
Somewhere between 6 and 10 million.
A country that had 10 million deaths.
Yep, due to one area of conflict since World War II.
Help us out.
Oh, I thought you'd know the answer. You know Keith.
Oh, it's in Africa.
The Congo.
Yeah.
Oh. The eastern part of the Congo.
What's
Isn't that interesting that you guys don't know?
10 million.
What's the conflict?
Well, it's. Do you remember the Rwandan genocide? It's all tied in with that, and then I don't want to spend all kinds of time now, but we were told, oh, there's the Hutus and the Tutsis. And
right.
No, it was a CIA assassination. A plane was shot down. Presidents were killed. Other ones were put in place, and conflict ensued from there. Rwanda pretty much tells the Congo what to do. We got puppet governments in place. These people, you know, the coltan, the precious mineral you need to run your cell phones and your laptops, it's mined in that part of the Congo. Okay, so
Those are
anybody
facts.
know anything about this? You know about this?
No. I mean,
So why isn't that in the mainstream news?
Yeah, right.
What they're not showing you is really
interesting
very
facts.
telling.
Yeah.
And that's how they do it.
Yeah.
It's not that they tell you kind of outright lies, it's that they omit to tell you another side of the story,
Yeah.
which gives you completely wrong
The thing is,
view.
That's right.
I'm close friends with Congolese refugees. I spent 14 hours with one of them yesterday. He was kidnapped out of school. He was a child soldier right there in the Goma area, North Kivu area of Congo. So I speak to these people directly, and I first heard more about it through Keith Harmon Snow, who's a human rights and genocide investigator, who has testified against some of the warlords, and he's on a hit list with the Rwandan government. This can be on film. He has said it himself.
Good. I didn't realize there were so many people.
And the thing is, I know that he has gotten so frustrated because he'll go and speak truth to a professor at Smith College. In the audience, Eric Reeves was speaking there about 5 years ago about the Darfur situation. Spreading propaganda. That guy's a tenured professor at Smith College.
That's why you can do that.
Keith's in the audience. I told him about the event. I couldn't make it that night. What happens as soon as Keith stands up and speaks truth to this tenured professor? He gets tackled by security. He is trespassed for life from not only Smith College, Mount Holyoke College and Hampshire College. Those three kind of work together.
Now that's weird. Why would they do that? He's just saying his opinion, right?
Because that professor has that power. The real problem here, the real point is that professor is not just a freaking professor.
No,
he is tied in with these world
maybe not,
governments.
but he's got some.
He's got big ties. You know?
Well, maybe
Eric Reeves.
Oh, yeah.
This is the whole thing.
I know who that is.
And you know who else goes to that same school? Paul Kagame's daughter. He's the president of Rwanda. That's part of this whole big problem.
See, those are just facts. You could just assume it's very.
I met a student who was in classes with that woman.
Thank
I
you.
get a little fired up.
All right, really, let's catch Wes.
It's right in our own backyard.
Let's go on the movie.
Right here.
And
Whilst in flight and for the duration of any stay on the lunar surface, the Apollo astronauts would have been totally at the mercy of unpredictable solar particle events. Solar flares could have affected any moon-bound astronaut at any time. A dose of 170 rem could result in vision impairment with a 20 to 30% probability of death within 60 days. Even a relatively low dose, around 70 rem, could result in vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea during the trip. Throwing up into a spacesuit is not something NASA would wish to be broadcast live on TV. There was even the possibility of an astronaut dying on the lunar surface in front of millions of viewers back on Earth. Therefore, sending astronauts to the moon with these risks could be described as playing American solar flare roulette.
With the Naval Research Laboratory, NASA launched the SOLRAD satellite. It too studies the sun's radiation and records the disturbances which can disrupt long-range communications and navigation systems. This computer-type picture shows the sun's disk and inner corona. It was returned by OSO 7, the latest in the orbiting solar observatory series. OSO is trying to determine the direct effects solar flares have on the environment, weather, and communications. Earth is surrounded by the magnetosphere, an enormous teardrop-shaped region formed by the solar wind, a supersonic stream of particles blowing on the Earth's magnetic field. It is in this region that a craft like the small scientific satellite does its job.
Einstein once presumed to speak for God when he joked, "God does not play dice." But some would say playing dice with nature is the game NASA played if the agency did indeed send insufficiently protected astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts and onwards to the moon. So now let's look at this question of radiation and see if and how it posed a serious threat to the successful outcome of Apollo. What in general terms are the dangers of radiation out in deep space? We're not referring to the heat coming from the sun, but the effect of solar particle events, SPEs, including X-rays and gamma rays, on our spacecraft and an unprotected astronaut traveling beyond the protected environment of his home planet. What actually happens when an astronaut leaves the Earth for the moon? A human being leaving Earth for deep space has to travel through the very thick ringed donut of trapped radiation which permanently encircles our planet. This donut contains within it two specific natural zones of very intense radiation. The whole region is named after Dr. James Van Allen, the scientist who registered this discovery in 1958. The innermost zone of the two Van Allen belts surrounds us only some 272 miles out from the Earth's surface.
Entering the Van Allen radiation belt from below, you would see the radiation levels rising considerably. In fact, they're higher within the belt than they are above it, and much higher than they are below it. And then as you got above the Van Allen radiation belt, the radiation would still be very, very high, but lower than this radiation that's trapped within the belt. So those form a formidable barrier to the passage of manned spacecraft within these belts. This radiation varies year by year. The sun has an 11-year sunspot cycle, and every 11 years it appears to repeat. And so every 11 years there's a peak of sunspot activity, and this is associated with a peak of solar radiation. These peaks have been charted from the 1800s all the way to the present. And one of the recent peaks was in 1958, which is one of the reasons they decided to have the International Geophysical Year, and one of the reasons that Explorer 1 discovered the Van Allen radiation belts and all of this type of phenomena. And since then, the next peak was in 1969 and 1970, right when the Apollo missions were supposed to have flown through them. They couldn't have picked a worse time to try to fly a manned flight through this radiation field.
Dr. James Van Allen had pointed out the necessity to shield the astronaut spacecraft adequately, given that these belts of trapped radiation were dangerous to bioorganisms. Since 1962, the Van Allen belts also possess another zone of even more intense radiation, which was artificially introduced by the American military. We suspect that with Operation Starfish Prime, the exploding of a megaton nuclear bomb 248 miles above Earth, NASA was trying to force a corridor through this natural danger zone, but ended up making matters worse. Astronomer Sir Bernard Lovell stated at the time that the effects of this explosion were cataclysmic, both here on Earth and out in space. The radiation created by this engineered explosion was trapped into a third belt, over 100 times more intense than the two natural belts. By 2002, this artificial zone will still be 25 times worse than the most intense zone of radiation trapped within the natural belts. Had NASA not only failed with Starfish Prime to create a corridor, but also increased the radiation risk to unprotected astronauts?
During their research, Bennett and Percy have found that the depth of these Van Allen belts varies considerably according to the source of reference. Despite the fact that numerous probes and the Apollo missions have allegedly traversed these zones of intense radiation, there's little or no agreement on the depth of these zones. James Van Allen stated that they're at least 64,000 miles deep, whereas NASA claims they're only about 24,000 miles deep. Less depth equals less travel time through this danger zone, and as NASA maintains that the Earth-Moon round trip would involve just about 2 hours in the belts, the agency could, and did, just about avoid the issue of spacecraft shielding by asserting that this was too short a time to be of any real danger to its astronauts.
Such a claim is rather like believing that rain will wet you less if you run through it. In reality, whether you move slowly or quickly through rain, you'll tend to get equally as wet. And so it is with radiation, except that with radiation you cannot dry off and return to the state you were before you were irradiated. Radiation is present throughout deep space and alters everything that it comes into contact with. It becomes a part of any bioorganism. Our research findings suggest that firstly, on a return journey to the Moon or Mars, an astronaut would spend around 4 hours within the trapped radiation of the Van Allen belts. And secondly, that to protect human beings adequately for the duration of such a journey in the late 1960s would require a spacecraft far too heavy for any of Wernher von Braun's rockets to launch.
But we're getting rather ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to von Braun's Saturn V rocket shortly. In an interview with researcher Jim Collier in the late 1990s, Dr. James Van Allen said that he stood by his evaluation of the depth and danger of the belts.
There are cosmic rays in space. You have the radiation flux that you have to deal with out there. We understood that. We monitored the sun very, very carefully. We did not send expeditions to the moon at times when there was the possibility of a particle event on the sun. We didn't want to subject the astronauts to any radiation that could come flying off the sun from a solar flare or a prominence or an event like that. But we thought it through very carefully, and we planned our way through that.
NASA would have us believe that to send its astronauts through space at the height of solar activity was a matter entirely under its control. But it's impossible even today to predict when debilitating solar flares are going to occur. Predicting earthquakes is virtually impossible too. This is the aftermath of the Turkish 1999 quake that came with no warning. And again, the Taiwanese 1999 earthquake.
So if the prediction of solar particle events is impossible, what were the means of protecting a crew when traveling through deep space in an unshielded, thin-walled rocket ship?
You could use propellant, structure, other parts of the craft, the heat shield. You would design it so that you would maximize the amount of material between you and the sun for the flight, but try to avoid carrying any material just for the sake of the shielding. It would serve a dual purpose.
With aluminium shielding, it's accepted that the minimum requirement is a thickness of 10 centimeters all around the craft. Was there any attempt to provide such protection?
No. The walls of the craft were made as thin and light as possible. The Apollo capsule itself was made unusually thin. In fact, they couldn't even initially carry enough air inside to be the equivalent to sea level air pressure. They ran it at reduced pressure in order to be able to make the walls thinner. And then the lem and other parts of the craft were all made out of very thin material, very flimsy. Almost no protection at all against solar radiation.
So why not try using a solid shield to protect the astronauts from these dangers?
Well, they didn't know how to shield like you suggest and still be able to make the weight capability of the Saturn V and carry everything to the moon. I believe that Wernher von Braun's team was basically assigned the task of designing a rocket that theoretically could take men to the moon if everything worked and if there were no substantial solar radiation. But the kind of rocket that they would have had to have in order to take people to the moon, taking into account solar radiation, would have been a much more massive vehicle, and they just decided that this was not something that they needed to deal with. They would just tell everybody that the radiation was okay.
A spherical structure enables a craft to withstand a greater amount of internal pressure. The Soviets knew this simple fact, and the designs for their spacecraft were always spherical. Here's a typical Vostok capsule. Compare this with the American thin-walled CSM design.
If NASA didn't know how to protect astronauts from radiation in deep space, it had not been for the want of trying. During the Manhattan Project and for years afterwards, the American government subjected nearly 250,000 Americans, both military and unwitting civilians, to the effects of radiation. These enforced tests provided data on how solar radiation might affect future astronauts. During the experimental detonations of atomic bombs, American military personnel were ordered to walk towards ground zero, totally unprotected. They were ordered to walk straight into the radiation zone, so that their masters could acquire an extensive information base relating to the injuries and damage caused to human tissue by those in close proximity to this radiation.
The surface of the moon is, of course, above the Van Allen radiation belts, and it's exposed to direct solar radiation. In 1959, they sent a spacecraft that flew past the moon. So that spacecraft could easily have, that one or others that followed it, could easily have contained instruments that showed them how lethal the radiation was. You don't need live animals to prove that something can't live out there. You can just send instruments that will show you that the radiation is beyond what can be withstood by animals or humans.
Solar flares and other storm systems on the sun can create enormous, tremendous surges of radiation. Now that radiation is not only potentially dangerous, it could be lethal to those who are outside our atmosphere, which basically protects us. All right, it can cause problems with radio storms and the aurora and things like that. But with major storms, there is a dramatic threat to those who are outside the Earth's atmosphere. And this would have happened with the Apollo missions. Of course, if there had been a major solar flare during an Apollo mission to the moon, it would have been extremely serious, to say the least.
The versatile IMP, 8th in a series, is exploring interplanetary space and the outer fringes of the Earth's magnetosphere. It also provides warnings of possible solar flare radiation hazards to moon-bound astronauts.
No major incident occurred, but it could have been potentially very, very bad, very bad, lethal, in fact.
Remember, solar flares occur all the time. It's the degree of their severity that varies. One of the most severe solar flares ever recorded occurred in August 1972 between Apollo missions 16 and 17. This single flare would have delivered 960 rem of virtually instant death to any inadequately protected astronaut out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field. Surely reason enough for the space agency to play safe and adopt the surrogate option as prediction of these events is a very inexact science indeed. Yet the named astronauts were wandering around on the supposed lunar surface in nothing more than what amounts to a thick linen suit. These pressure suits might have allowed for some micrometeorite protection and possibly maintained an appropriate temperature for the astronaut, but they certainly did not qualify as adequate protection against any unexpected burst of debilitating radiation from an SPE. And as if that were not enough, despite strict medical instructions, in some cases these astronauts neglected to use the protective gold visors to shield their faces. Whether this was whistleblowing or sheer arrogance, it is certainly another example of inconsistency in the record, over and beyond that of image manipulation. Forgetting the astronauts for a moment, what indeed could this solar radiation do to the images? We know, for example, how X-rays can affect film on Earth, and we know how the photographs of the damaged Chernobyl nuclear power station were badly fogged from radiation.
You have an enormous amount of radiation in space, and potentially it affects film, of course, and of course, as you will well know, its prime effect is on contrast.
We took a latent image recorded on the film of a color test chart and exposed it to 8 MeV X-rays. The lowest radiation dose we applied to the film was 25 rem. The latent image, if it hadn't been subjected to radiation, would look like this: a good quality, high contrast, color transparency. After exposure to the 25 rem radiation, the image is almost entirely obliterated. This means, in my estimation, a dose as little as 5 rem would seriously undermine the transparency. It would look significantly fogged. It would be a very thin image.
If you look at the results, top quality duplicates, you can see that there appears to be no effect whatsoever. It never got to the stage where I heard, at least, that a film had been badly affected by temperature or the pressure differentiation or radiation.
I would expect to see on the transparencies evidence of small bright dots where a high velocity nuclear particle had impinged on that film. I have no evidence whatsoever that this has occurred. The good place to look for it is on the regions of the film which haven't been exposed in the camera, the black spaces, as it were, between the frames. We're protected on Earth by a nice thick atmosphere, and that combined with the magnetic field keep these ionizing particles away from us, on film of course. In space, you're not offered that protection. To prevent an ionizing particle, well, very energetic particles that you get in space, from damaging the film, you would need a significant thickness of lead protecting that film.
So if the film exhibited no signs of radiation damage, then surely the camera itself must have been protected. Was the Hasselblad lunar surface camera shielded from radiation?
Well, the original ones were not protected at all. The ones they brought to the lunar surface were painted silver.
The temperature, of course, is very, very extreme on the lunar surface. In the sunlight, you could be easily as high as about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, in shadow areas and prolonged shadow, you could be in minus quantities.
As far as I know, they had no trouble with overheating of the film. And I think it worked for them, because I didn't hear any complaints about the film getting too warm. On the other hand, they might have had some trouble if the film got too cold, because then it cracked.
Would any of the problems cited have anything at all to do with Kodak's strange reticence to capitalize commercially on the film used for the lunar surface photography?
Although various films were tried by NASA, to all intents and purposes, it was only Kodak film which was used during Project Apollo. And I think, and one understands it, I think that the corporate management in Rochester was concerned about a monopoly situation. I think that was the reason, you know, and it's sad in some ways because there was an enormous amount could be made of the fact that it was Kodak film being used.
Okay, let's see, how do I do this? F11 at 74. Click.
Here's the pan. Okay.
Click. 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 Okay, Tony, do you want me to change the mags on the
EVA
16? It's about empty. Click. That's affirmative. Per second runs it through there.
Right, go ahead.
Okay, will do.
Should be mag R.
Click. Okay. Man, if I get this top of this and that picture, it's going to be a miracle. Click. Okay, Tony, during this pan, I've moved about 2 feet downslope, so I don't know if things are going to match up too well or not.
We'll make it work.
And if both the film and camera had problems with heat and cold, then how did the astronauts themselves stay cool? It was the job of the life support system, the PLIS, to regulate the body temperatures. How did that backpack actually keep an astronaut cool and likewise warm when they were working in the cold of the shadow areas?
Somehow they would have to radiate the heat away, and that's not an easy task because the rate that heat is radiated away goes up according to the 4th power of the temperature difference between the radiator and the surrounding medium. So you have to have a pretty hot radiator to radiate away a substantial amount of heat. It would be more likely that you would eject steam, because in taking the heat away from the astronaut, that heat would be used to heat water up and produce steam. So you should see venting of steam if they're using water for this purpose, rather than ice, actually.
We never once saw any ice crystals or indeed steam emanating from the vicinity of any astronaut, either spasmodically or on a regular basis. Not one piece of TV coverage demonstrates such an effect. Interestingly, many researchers, including Ralph Rene, also seriously doubt whether the PLIS had enough capacity for the job in the first place. In this part of the program, we've looked at the dangers of radiation and the serious problems to have been overcome on any journey to and from the moon. Clearly, in the 1960s, no one had the ability to deliver a guarantee against astronauts dying in space. This reason alone would have been sufficient motive for the falsification of what really happened during Apollo.